to my social influence revision video. I've based this around the AQA specification, but it will be applicable to most other exam boards offering psychology. Starting off with types of conformity. You need to know the two explanations for conformity and the three types of conformity that explain social influence. An influence, by definition, is a process where people agree or disagree about appropriate behaviours and maintain or change social norms accordingly. So starting with the highest level of conformity, compliance. When someone asks us to do something, we might comply with their request. We might agree to do someone a favour, for example. Compliance can be viewed as the first step towards internalisation. However, we may agree in public but disagree in private. The middle level of conformity is identification. Sometimes we feel that a part of our group is our identity, and we value that feeling and publicly respect and follow the attitudes and behaviour of that group. We may still disagree with some of the aspects of the group behaviour in private. And the bottom level of conformity is internalisation. When someone truly takes on the beliefs and attitude of a group, they internalise them and they become their own beliefs. They have effectively conformed. They agree both publicly and privately with the group. So, reasons for conformity. Starting with normative social influence. In this influence, people conform because they fear being isolated and they want to be part of a group. Others are seen as having the power to approve or disapprove of us. The conflict between our private beliefs and what we feel we have to say out loud leads to compliance, but this could just be temporary while in the presence of the group. Next, informational social influence. Wanting to be correct in the presence of others is a powerful influence. The need for certainty makes us seek information to reinforce our perception of a situation. So we look to see what other people are doing, we then compare ourselves with others, and we may internalise their beliefs as ours. Now the Ash study, starting with AO1. Ash wanted to measure the strength of the conformity effect using an unambiguous task. Between 7 and 9 Confederates sat in a line or a semicircle. Ash gave naive participants a seemingly obvious task, to match 3 vertical lines on a card to 1 comparison line. On the first 2 trials, the Confederates gave the right answers, but on the third they gave the wrong answer. The dependent variable was who would conform to the Confederate and give the wrong answer, having heard their answers first. The naive participants conformed to the wrong answer 36.8% of the time. 25% of those participants never conformed. There was also a control trial, with no Confederates, to check that the task was unambiguous. Mistakes were made only 1% of the time, which is far less under the experimental condition. In conclusion, some individuals' judgments and decisions are influenced by a majority opinion, even when the majority opinion is obviously wrong. Although 36.8% is not the majority, participants conformed at least once to the majority, 75% of the time. Moving on to AO3, there was no ambiguity in the task, and therefore he was measuring conformity and not people's ability to perceive small differences in length, giving it internal validity. However, the setup was artificial, and the task was an odd thing to be discussing around a table, thus it lacks external validity or mundane realism. The study also lacked ethics, as they were deceived into thinking it was a visual perception task and not a task measuring conformity. Sticking with Ash's study, variables affecting conformity. Ash identified a number of situational variables that influence levels of conformity. These include group size, unanimity, and task difficulty, and you need to know how these 3 affect conformity. Starting with group size, Ash's research indicated that a majority of 3 was enough to create conformity, so the rate of conformity increased as the size of the majority influence increased, but only to a certain point. After that there was very little difference. Now unanimity. If the naive participant had a fellow dissenter, he would be more likely to resist the majority and conformity fell to 1/4 of the original level. However, if the naive participant had a fellow dissenter and then lost them, they would be more likely to conform. This type of conformity was more likely to be internalisation, because he would have identified more strongly with someone who shared his opinion. And lastly, task difficulty. Ash made the difference between lines less obvious in one variation, and found that as task difficulty increased, so did conformity, which suggests informational social influence was at work. Moving on to Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. Starting with AO1. 21 male volunteer college students were drawn from a pool of 75 and paid $15 a day. They were checked for mental and physical health and randomly divided into prisoners and guards. Using a controlled observation, a realistic mock prison was created in the basement of Stanford University. Guards arrived first, set up the prison, and decided the rules. They were not allowed to use physical violence. They all worked shifts and went home in between. The prisoners were arrested by real police, taken to the station where they were fingerprinted, and then taken blindfolded to the mock prison. They were randomly allocated to the cells and they were all strangers. The uniforms of both the groups were designed to dehumanize the students, smocks and numbers for the prisoners and dark mirrored sunglasses for the guards. Prisoners quickly became passive and negative in their attitudes, while guards became more active. 5 prisoners had to be released because of extreme reactions to the situation, but the rest endured the study until it was ended after just 6 days out of the possible 14. The guards showed pathology of power, meaning that they enjoyed the absolute control they had over the prisoners. This was exhibited by many actions such as making toilet visits a privilege and making the prisoners do press-ups. The fake prison situation can create a realistic role-play to study the relationship between prisoners and guards and its destructive effect on human nature. Moving on to AO3. The study lacks ethics. There were severe reactions by the prisoners, although there was a very thorough debrief afterwards. Secondly, there was observer bias. Zimbardo has since admitted he lost his objectivity as the prison governor and got too involved. And lastly, not all participants showed conformity to their role. Some maintained their identity and resistance, and some used this study as a chance to express their sadistic beliefs. Milgram study on obedience, starting with AO1. Milgram's aim was to investigate obedience to an authority figure using a laboratory-based procedure. Naive participants drew lots to be the teacher or the learner and always ended up as the teacher. The teacher has to read one half of a word pair and the learner had to supply the other half. Once in a while, the learner would get it wrong and get a shock. The experimenter had 4 prompts to use if the teacher is reluctant to continue, one being please continue and the other being you have no choice. The learner, which was always a Confederate, was appearing to be more distressed while pretending to be shocked. A sample of 40 men answered a newspaper advertisement to volunteer for the experiment. The lab was set up as above. The prompts from the experimenter created the independent variable, and the dependent variable was how far in volts the participant would go to shock the learner. The experimenter wore a grey lab coat to accent his legitimate authority, and the voltage levels went up in 15-volt increments to a maximum of 450 volts, creating a gradual commitment. The learner gave predetermined recorded responses, gradually increasing in pain. In result, there were signs of extreme tension in most of the participants, including one who had a seizure. All participants went up to 300 volts, and 75% went up to 450 volts. In conclusion, people are surprisingly obedient to authority, even when being told to inflict pain for no good reason. Agentic theory seems to work in this scenario. Moving on to AO3. Milgram debriefed his participants extremely thoroughly, and 84% of his participants were pleased to have taken part. However, there was no conformed dissent, and participants were very stressed and not protected, although they met the unharmed learner at the end. Lastly, the task did not reflect real-life obedience, so it has low ecological validity. Moving on to explanations for obedience. You need to know 2 explanations for why people obey orders in various situations, the first being agentic state. Milgram believed that we exist in 2 different states, the first being the autonomous state, where we show free will and make our own choices and decisions, and the second being the agentic state. We follow instructions from someone we perceive has legitimate authority over us, such as a teacher or a police officer. We learn this through socialization. When we're asked to do something we do not like, that is immoral or unjust, we experience moral strain and feel uncomfortable and stressed. However, once we have shifted into an obedient state, we feel relieved of the strain and we displace this responsibility onto the authority figure. Hoffling used the hospital hierarchy to test obedience in nurses. A Confederate doctor rang a ward and asked the nurse to give twice the marked safe dose of an unknown drug to a patient. 21 out of 22 of those nurses obeyed the orders against hospital rules. When a control group of 22 nurses were asked what they would have done, they denied they would have acted without proper authorization in writing. Hoffling concluded that power hierarchy in hospitals was a bigger influence on nurses than following hospital rules. The second explanation for obedience, legitimacy of authority. Milgram believed that society is hierarchical. People are ranked from top to bottom and naturally obey those higher up the order than themselves. This happens because children are socialized to obey their parents and teachers from an early age. An army is a strong hierarchy, and soldiers are trained to obey orders without question. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers entered the village of My Lai and were ordered by their lieutenant to shoot the inhabitants. They killed everyone, even small children. Later, when on trial, they said they were just obeying orders. The soldiers were no longer autonomous, but agents of the army. The responsibility for the massacre rested on the United States. Milgram went on to investigate many more variables. The three you need to know are proximity, location, and uniform. They are all variations on the original experiment using the same basic setup or paradigm, and they look at external or situational explanations of obedience. The first is proximity of the learner. Proximity increases awareness of obeying an order. A task is harder when you see the person you're hurting. Milgram found that when both the teacher and the learner are in the same room, the obedience rate falls to 40%. The second is proximity of authority. If the person giving the orders is right next to you, it's harder to disobey them. Milgram found that when the experimenter would leave their room and give the instructions on the phone, obedience levels would fall to 22.5%, and teachers would tend to lie about the levels of shocks they were giving. The next two situational variables are location and uniform. Starting with location. The location of an experiment can alter the level of obedience. When Milgram ran the study at the prestigious Yale University, the obedience level was 65%. When Milgram conducted the study in a rundown office block, obedience fell to 48%. Being in a prestigious setting increases legitimate authority. The next situational variable, uniform. Wearing a uniform can increase the perception of authority. When the experimenter wore a grey lab coat, obedience levels were at 65%. When the experimenter was wearing ordinary clothes, obedience levels dropped to just 20%. Moving on to the dispositional explanation of obedience. Adorno proposed there was an authoritarian personality. This type of person was hostile towards other ethnic groups, had no time for weakness, and was obedient towards authority. Therefore, your personality could make you more obedient. Starting with AO1. Adorno's aim was to investigate the authoritarian personality. He had a sample of 2,000 American participants who agreed or disagreed with statements so that researchers could determine their attitudes towards religious and ethnic minorities, their groups on politics and economics, and their moral values. Adorno believed that certain attitudes represented the authoritarian personality. About 100 of those 2,000 were then interviewed in depth, including questions on upbringing. His sample included the most and least prejudiced from the scales. Adorno found correlations between his scales, showing the strength of the generalized prejudice in his sample. These individuals had an us or them mentality. These characteristics of the authoritarian personality make them hostile to all non-conventional people, and they believe in power and toughness and the rule of the law. In conclusion, children who grew up in harsh disciplinarian families may repress their hostility towards parents and seem to idolize them. In later life, they act as in a submissive way towards authority figures. Their repressed hostility towards their parents is displaced onto non-threatening minority groups as prejudice and discrimination. Moving on to AO3. The response set had problems as all the statements invited agreement despite giving the option to disagree. The interviewers were also biased because the interviewer knew the F-scale dimensions. Social identity theory is more of a convincing explanation of obedience. Moving on to resistance to social influence. Not all of Ash's and Milgram's participants behaved as expected. This suggests that more people are resistant to social influence than others. So, starting with AO1, locus of control. This concept was identified by Rotter and can be used to explain resistance to social influence. It refers to how much people believe they're in control of their own lives. To measure your locus of control, you complete scales that force you to choose between two extremes on a scale of 1 to 10. For example, there is no such thing as fate or destiny, or life is a game of chance. A person with an internal locus of control believes they are always responsible for their behavior. Because of this, they are more likely to seek more information before following orders. The other type is external locus of control. A person with an external locus of control sees their life as being controlled by luck, chance, or by others, especially others with more power. They are more likely to obey an authority figure. Now AO3. The locus of control self-report inventory has been standardized and used over vast samples, which increases its validity. Secondly, Holland showed the internal locus of control people showed greater resistance to authority in a replication of Milgram's 1963 study. And lastly, a psychologist found that external locus people have increased in number over time, but resistance to authority has increased as well, which sheds some doubt onto the concept. Moving on to minority influence. Sometimes a strong minority or an individual can sway public opinion and change previously held attitudes. Think, for example, of the gay rights movement, the suffragettes, or even Nelson Mandela. Starting with AO1. Conversion theory suggests that when a minority has informational social influence over the majority, by providing them with new information and challenges to the majority, it can convert the majority to the new ideas or beliefs. For a minority to affect change, it has to be consistent in its message between the people in the group and over time. Secondly, people who show commitment to a cause through strong actions and personal suffering are more likely to be believed. And lastly, flexibility. Minorities who are consistent but inflexible are less persuasive. Rigidly sticking to the same arguments is unappealing, and a degree of flexibility is a more successful style. Moscovici studied the effects on minority influence. His aim was to examine the effects of a consistent minority on the majority using an unambiguous task. Groups of 4 naive participants and 2 Confederates were asked to estimate the color of 36 slides. All the slides were blue, but the brightness was varied by adding filters. In one condition, the 2 Confederates called the slides green on all the trials in the hearing of the naive participants. In another condition, the minority varied the consistency of their responses. The control group was not released to the minority. The naive participants agreed that the slide was blue 8.42% of the trials, and 32% said the slides were green at least once in the consistent trial. In the inconsistent trial, only 1.25% gave green responses compared to the control group, who just gave 2 wrong answers, which is 0.25%. In conclusion, these results are small changes, but they're significant. They show that a minority can sway the majority, even when absent, as long as the consistency is maintained. Moving on to AO3. The studies used artificial laboratory experiments, so they lack ecological validity and internal validity. There's also an ethical deceit, as they were told it was a visual perception task. However, in another condition, Moscovici found that getting his participants to write their answers privately after exposure to the minority view maintained the conformity effect, even in its absence. Moving on to social change. If the minority stays committed and consistent to their views, the majority will start to listen due to informational social influence. The majority will start to join the minority until the minority reaches critical mass. Once the minority reaches critical mass, people will start to join due to normative social influence. Then social cryptoamnesia occurs and everyone forgets how the change happened. Thank you for listening to the video. Good luck on your exams.